Hello everyone and welcome to this video on an overview of globalization. So for this unit we are going to be looking periodically and quite frequently at the concept of globalization. It's really impossible to understand how international businesses operate within the international arena without understanding globalization, but we have a significant problem in that globalization is an immensely contested term. There's lots of different understandings of globalization. There's lots of different views on globalization and perspectives, and it has become one of these terms which seems to mean whatever the speaker wants the term to mean at that particular time. And if we add to this the increasingly fractured and contested political landscape across the world, where globalization has become a bit of a challenging term. So we have increasing references to the globalists and the globalist agenda amongst the what you could term the alt-right, or what's probably more honest to say is the resurgence of fascist thought and an increasing number of fascist movements in various parts of the world, where globalist is seen as a dirty term, a conspiratorial term, something very, very negative, with connotations of control and murder and all sorts, and pizza restaurants having basements where kids are eaten, all kinds of nutty madness. But we also have various movements across the world in the global south, in countries that some would term developing countries or the third world, where globalism and globalization is seen as something which has negative impacts, which connotations of exploitation and so on, economic and political and social dominance. So there is a lot of contestation around this term globalization, and I think Thomas Eriksson, a sociologist, said it quite well. It may appear to be a fashionable label used to designate phenomena that one but has vaguest ideas about. So something which is quite vague, which covers a huge amount of ground. Now, this is true to an extent, but we can try and pin down roughly what we mean by globalization by treating it not really as a single process or one precise thing, but as a label which covers a range of different processes which are related and in some ways interconnected, but really have at their heart a single concept which is used to understand all of these different processes through. And that concept for us really is interconnectedness. So globalization can be understood as an increasing sense of interconnectedness in many different ways. So whether that's interconnectedness in a social sense, and we think about the ease that we can just open up a laptop or pick up a mobile phone, we can communicate with people halfway around the world or completely on the other side of the world. We can engage in social networks across borders and across cultures, and increasingly with the use of AI technology, we can communicate across languages with things like Google Translate and other technologies. So that's very interconnected. We also have a massively interconnected economic system, where it's really the only way to understand economics today is to understand the world as an economic system rather than a set of interlinking or interconnected national economies. And this is again something that we can see in the rise of discontent and other trends in terms of national politics, where national politicians have relatively limited or increasingly limited control of the economy. We can see this in Greece during the monetary crisis, where the EU, the IMF, the World Bank all had massive roles to play in both the creation of the Greek crisis and also in how the Greek financial crisis was handled. So economically, the world is increasingly interconnected as well. And we see this across a range of different processes. So if we keep this concept in mind, that when we talk about globalization, we're talking about a sense of increasing interconnectedness across the world. This helps us understand why globalization is such a contested term. Some of these types of interconnectedness result in winners amongst individuals and groups involved. Some will involve losers. Some will be experienced in very different ways depending on whereabouts in the world you're being impacted, or your interaction with the process, depending on your social class and so on. So it really is a complex set of processes. It's not one thing. We really shouldn't think of globalization as just one thing. So we can see here a list of processes of globalization. So these are ways that globalization, or this sense of interconnectedness, really is expressed. And some are economic. So economic liberalization, a general set of policies which is now really being called into question from several different angles around how to arrange our economic affairs, how to integrate our economies with the global economy, which is closely connected to another one, which is free trade. So the removal of trade barriers, the increasing specialization of different regions of the world, the production and delivery of goods and services being increasingly global, and free trade itself then is closely connected to globalization of economic activity. And this is important because this allows us to distinguish globalization of economic activity from things like international trade. So trade is trading components, goods and services across national borders, but we've gotten to the stage now where it really stops making sense to talk about particular countries producing particular goods and services. They are produced globally. They're produced across different countries. So we can just take the iPhone or any modern day smartphone as a example par excellence of globalization of economic activity. So your smartphone or even your laptop is not produced in one country. It'll be designed across multiple countries. Say for a smartphone, the RAM modules may come from South Korea. The camera lens may come from Japan. Some of the code will again come from different contributors across different countries. It may be assembled in one location, but even that's a bit of a simplification. There's multiple levels of assembly. Different components will be assembled in different places, and there is usually, when we talk about smartphones, likely South Korea or China or India, where the phone is actually finally put together in its final form. But it would be a mistake to say that the iPhone is made in China. The final assembly occurs in China, but the processes that produce that iPhone are really globalized. They occur in multiple places across the world. This is not the same thing as silk being produced in China and then being sold in Europe, as it has been for many centuries and millennia. That's a pretty straightforward example of trade. So silk is produced in one country and then it's sold in another country. The iPhone doesn't fit into that pattern. The iPhone is an example of the globalization of economic activity. But to support that globalization of economic activity, as well as economic liberalization and free trade, we have things like international trade blocks and agreements, things like the EU. We have the WTO, various mechanisms to either smooth, block, increase or decrease the level of economic integration and economic activity across borders. So those are all relatively linked, but we've got other ones which are far more diffuse. So we also have a sense of increasing interconnectedness through travel. So the ability to travel, to migrate, to move across the world. Now, this is important to say that this is a sense of increasing interconnectedness. To think that prior to globalization, people didn't move across borders would be massively wrong. It would be buying into national myths that say that France is French and the French people have always lived in France, and It's only relatively recently that we've started having foreigners moving into various countries. That's a myth, and a very dangerous myth at that. The history of humanity has been the history of migration, has been the history of travel. You only need to look at the UK. Let's ignore any migration post Windrush, so any migration from the Afro-Caribbean countries, or any migration from South Asia or from West Africa, and you still have a history of migration from the French Normans to the Saxons from areas of Germanic origin, to the Vikings, to various movements within the British Isles themselves. Even the history of Northern Ireland, the history of Protestant Scots moving to the counties in Northern Ireland, centuries ago. It's the history of migration and travel. What's changed now, however, is both the scope and the intensity of that migration and travel. So global travel for leisure and business purposes is at historically unprecedented levels. We have a far greater sense of interconnectedness. Many of you, no doubt, will have traveled to multiple countries. It's really not noteworthy. It's fairly normal to have foreign holidays, although we'll see how that continues after the COVID-19 pandemic. But there is absolutely greater ease and intensity of travel, but even migration itself, migration for short-term purposes, the actual intensity of migration itself within relatively short periods really is increasing. So we still have this increasing sense of interconnectedness. We can add to that cultural, technical and artistic connectivity, where kind of culture really does cross borders. We have interconnectedness. So rap music, a genre of music which was born out of really just certain boroughs in New York, a very particular cultural and socioeconomic and racial experience that gave birth to hip hop and rap music, now is a global culture, but it's an interactive culture. French rap or North African rap or East Asian rap takes on elements or derived from the roots of hip hop music in New York, but has a very distinctive spin. There's infusion of local cultures, expression of local experiences and perspectives. So we see that connectivity in our art, we see that connectivity in our culture, but also in really simple things like technical connectivity. We see connectivity in being able to post a letter and have faith that it will reach its destination. So if you post a letter from, say, London going to Peru, it's going to arrive in Peru. But the level of technical connectivity that's required there, the interactions and the framework agreements between the different post services, from email, from the actual logistics of getting that mail to various sorting centers, various different countries along the way as well, and then in the end arriving in Peru, and the stamp that you paid for in, say, a London post office, that money being distributed along that chain to all the dozens and dozens of different organizations and actors that participated in getting your letter from London to Peru, really is an astonishing example of the degree of technical interconnectedness that exists in today's world. Just the last 2 points is worth touching upon briefly. Global civil society and INGOs are another example of this interconnectedness in a distinctly different way. So our awareness of what's happening in various countries and regions around the world, but our ability to interact, engage, influence, really is unprecedented as well. So if you want to get engaged with grassroots Yemeni organizations, get involved in Yemeni politics, you want to get involved in lobbying, you want to get involved in interacting with those groups, it very much is possible and does happen. So that kind of degree of global civil society groups and international non-governmental organizations really is a distinctive stream or process of globalization unto itself. And lastly, global diffusion of knowledge. Really good example is the video you're watching now, which is hosted on YouTube. So the internet itself is an astonishing example of not just a communications technology, but an avenue, a channel for the global diffusion of knowledge. Knowledge flows back and forth in many different forms, but certainly modern globalization has allowed us to diffuse knowledge far and wide, both deliberately and also in ways that are not intended, and that again gives a huge interconnection of knowledge, a huge sense of interconnection, as well as just simple things like being able to closely follow news about various places around the world, interact with people. That is again quite a distinctive hallmark of globalization. Now, I've used the term modern globalization quite a few times, so that does lead on to a natural question of, is globalization actually new? Is it right to talk about modern globalization and globalization being a modern phenomena? Well, it's a complex answer, and there's lots of different perspectives on this. But we can say is that interconnectedness to some degree really isn't new. And this is partly connected to national myths that leave us with the impression that there's such thing as, say, English people that existed in England, and then they slowly started to interact or engage in connectivity with neighbours. That's a national myth. Nations are relatively new, nation states are even newer, and the history of humanity has always involved connection and interaction. So the Silk Road, for example, which goes back millennia, has firmly connected China, East Asia, mainland Asia and South Asia, the Middle East, North Africa and Europe. And in fact, the history of humanity, particularly when we think of Asia, Africa, and Europe, is far more connected than we may imagine. The key thing is the Mediterranean Sea. The Roman Empire wasn't a European empire. The Roman Empire was a Mediterranean state. The same thing when we look at North African empires. The same thing when we look at what today would call Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, and Turkey. We place them into categories of being, either in Europe or North Africa or Asia, but really the Mediterranean Sea provided an excellent geographical space for massive interaction and exchange. Someone who lived in what's today Italy had far more in common with someone who lived in what today would be Tunisia than between the Italian and the German. So kind of the Silk Road and the history of humanity tells us that, these interactions, cultural, economic, and even political interactions aren't new. Another great example would be Alexander the Great, who conquered the known world at the time, so moved from Macedonia through to Asia Minor, conquered the Persian Empire, and then fought on the banks of the Indus River in India, and came back through Arabia and conquered Egypt as well. So that legacy, that ethnically and culturally mixed legacy, is really evident. Nice simple thing you can do is look at the number of places, number of cities named Alexandria or various variations, and just look at their locations. You have Alexandrias pretty much across the world. You have a syncretic legacy across the world as well. So in that sense, globalization isn't new because there has been a sense of interconnectedness pretty much throughout history. This is very much focused on Europe, Asia, and Africa, which are in close proximity. But the same thing could be said of the Peloponnesian Islands. The same thing could be said of North and South America as well, which existed in their own kind of interactive bubble, so to speak, with various different cultures, ethnicities, and so on throughout history. So that much isn't new. However, what is new is the intensity and the scale of that sense of interconnectedness. And here the World Bank gives us a nice three-stage kind of framework to understand modern globalization. So while a global interaction and sense of interconnectedness has arguably always been there to a degree. Post 1879, where we see the real birth of European colonial empires. So the Portuguese Empire, French Empire, British Empire, and the Dutch Empire are definitely noteworthy, and certainly the Spanish Empire when it comes to South and Central America, very noteworthy. We start seeing much lower trade barriers, the emergence of a single economic unit when it comes to the individual empires. So it's impossible to understand why the UK, which, let's be honest, a relatively small island with limited natural resources off the coast of Europe, is one of the richest countries in the world, cannot understand this without understanding the British Empire and the economic connectivity and interactions within the British Empire. And this was really facilitated by massive advances in communications and transportations technology. The telegraph is a huge one. You may think communications in 1879 couldn't have been that advanced, but the telegraph itself and telegraphs really enabled, at the time, was astonishingly almost instantaneous communication, or communication within a gap of a few hours rather than a gap of days or weeks or months, in some cases even years. Same thing when it comes to transportation and advances in transportation technology. Significantly, steam trains were very influential here as well. So certainly with the advent of modern, or certainly at the time, European colonial empires, we saw a huge boost in the scale and intensity of interconnectedness, or the sense of interconnectedness, and that had another big jump in the post-World War II era. So the world's moving into a period of decolonialization. European colonial empires were gradually dismantled, pretty much uniformly across all the major empires, although some exceptions, as always, did exist. But also saw the Marshall Plan in Europe, the increasing huge economic integration as a result between Europe and the US. Japan increasingly integrated as the US oversaw the rebuilding and reintegration of Japan and other areas as well. So really big economic integration, a huge jump in the scale and intensity of economic globalization here certainly occurred. And then post 1980, we see increasing economic participation in this with developing nations, and we also see another jump in not just economic globalization but other processes of globalization with the advent of the internet in particular, and other forms of interconnectivity. So not a nice simple answer, but certainly we have the outlines of an answer here to the question of, is globalization really new? And the answer is, well, kind of yes. Globalization, as understood as this kind of really intense, large-scale sense of interconnectivity and interconnectedness, is very much new. It has already been born over the last century or so. However, we have to keep that in perspective with the realization that national myths about people's living in isolation through the centuries until they encountered neighbors is simply not true either. That there always has been some interconnectivity, there always has been some degree of interaction between different cultures and regions in the world, pretty much forever, really. But what we're seeing today is still on a completely different scale with regards to the intensity of that interconnection. And now, just finally, just to try and highlight just how complex these issues are, and how we have to remember to be nuanced and try and develop our understanding of different perspectives. We're just going to run through some different some different visualizations of globalization. So I really do like maps. They help us understand and grasp issues in a different way than just reams of text or figures and numbers. So if you look here at a map with different colors based upon the size of the GDP per capita, so you're using GDP here, as a proxy for wealth, and we see that economic globalization in particular has not resulted in uniform wealth creation and uniform wealth distribution across the world, but it is very much lopsided. So this is taken from 2016, and there will be some changes today, but the pattern is largely the same. We see the Anglosphere and Europe being very much amongst the richest countries in the world. So the Anglosphere are the former British colonies, English-speaking colonies of Canada, the United States of America, Australia, New Zealand, along with Europe generally, but particularly Western Europe specifically, very much reaping the major rewards from this kind of massive single global economic system or integrated global economic system, alongside countries such as Japan, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, and so on. So there is a lopsidedness, and we also see a really remarkable feat here, that the continent of Africa in particular has astonishingly low GDP, especially if we consider the natural resources present in Africa. We consider some of the history of civilizations in Africa. So that itself is not a natural situation. That's the result of both the colonial past, the near past, as well as current and modern economic flows and the configuration of economic globalization. So that's very much a recent and particularly complex and thorny situation, which has led to this kind of stark difference between Africa, parts of Latin America, and also South Asia and parts of East Asia as a whole. So this distinction between what I would term the global north and the global south, there are lots of other terms to describe this distinction, all with various ideological baggage. But certainly we have to understand that economic globalization is not a uniform process, nor is it uniformly positive if we take increasing wealth to be a good thing. It's not uniformly distributed and is not uniformly generated, and it very much is bound up in history more than anything else. As well as GDP, I just want to pull up personal computers, because we've had a big talk about the impact of the internet and communications technology in kind of creating this sense of global interconnectedness. Well, the internet and communications technology is only useful insofar as you can actually access the internet. And we see, and 2004 is relevant here, it's relatively old, but there's a big change recently. We see with PCs, they are not uniformly distributed. So people's access to the internet, access to global communications network, and therefore how interconnected they actually are in practice, is very much lopsided. So the greater the number of personal computers, the larger that country is distorted to be relative to its geographical size. So tons of computers in Western Europe, tons of computers in North America, far fewer in Latin America, far fewer in Africa, far fewer in Asia as well. The thing which has changed, however, is simply that personal computers are no longer the only mechanism to access the internet. So we see the rise of smartphones in particular has very much changed this picture. So if we understand smartphones now really being the primary means and sometimes the only means of accessing the internet for millions and millions of people across the world, particularly in the global south, then that does change that picture somewhat. Our third visualization is the size of global box office, so size of worldwide box office. So here country sizes are distorted by how much they've captured the global box office revenue, or the size of their share of global box office revenue. Because we often talk about globalization and interconnectedness being a global conversation, and that is very true in many cases. We take part in this global conversation when we consume media, when we enjoy art and other things are produced across the world. But this conversation isn't an equal conversation. There are certain voices in this global conversation which are much louder, which have greater reach and influence than other voices. So here we see that if we take global box office to be a proxy for this global conversation, and very much the stories that we tell ourselves and the cinema that we watch has a huge role in identity formation, and the way we relate to other peoples around us, and the way we relate to the world as a whole, that we see that the US and Hollywood has a huge share of this conversation. France, because of its various protectionist policies, and also its colonial empires, has a big share. The UK film industry is very much connected to the US film industry and is also very large. India, due to Bollywood, and Japan and South Korea, because of very strong and culturally influential cinema industry, is also very large. But very few stories in this global conversation are being told by Latin America, by Africa, and by the rest of Asia. So we see again, this is not an equal conversation that we're having. And lastly, our last map is news. So we talked about, the diffusion of knowledge across the world, the diffusion of news, the fact that you can follow news stories around the world, anywhere in the world, is astonishing and noteworthy, but we don't actually do this. The stories we actually read about, again, are skewed. So globalization is more complex than saying, well, if you want to know what's happening in Chile, or you want to know what's happening in Liberia, you can. The fact is, we generally don't want to know what's happening in this world. It's a skewed phenomena. So here we see a map, another distorted map. So this is the UK has been removed here, and this is the stories that readers in the UK, or not just the UK, but readers of the Guardian online website are visiting. So what are we actually reading about? What kind of countries and what national stories are we following? And it seems to see we're really interested in what happens in Europe for obvious reasons. We're really massively interested in what's happening in the United States. We don't seem to really care what's happening in Latin America, and we don't seem to care what's happening in the vast majority of Africa, nor in most of Asia either. And there is a big distortion near the center of the map, but it is worth pointing out this data has been taken from 2010, 2012. This was the time span where various revolutions in the Arab world took place and the Arab Spring was in full effect. So we see Egypt and Libya particularly large, as well as the perennial will be the wrong word, the modern conflict in Palestine and Israel, again taking up a disproportionate amount of news that we're consuming. But apart from that, large sections of the global south are relatively underrepresented in the news that we consume. So there is a huge amount of interconnectivity and a huge amount of interconnectedness here, but it's not equal. There are lots of nuances and power differentials at play here as well.